Pay attention to what Mark Carney did in the 48 hours after his government secured a majority, because the sequence matters. Monday night, April 13th, 3 by-elections close. By midnight, all 3 are won. The Liberal seat count moves to 174. Full control of the House of Commons. 2-seat cushion above the majority threshold. The first Canadian Prime Minister in history to convert a minority into a majority through floor crossings, confirmed and extended through the ballot box. Tatiana Auguste wins Terrebonne by over 700 votes, with all polls reporting, after the Supreme Court of Canada had annulled her one-vote victory from a year earlier due to an Elections Canada clerical error. Doly Begum wins Scarborough Southwest with roughly 70% of the vote. Danielle Martin wins University-Rosedale with roughly 65%. Both margins exceed what the previous Liberal incumbents had posted in those ridings. And the morning after, Canada activates the next phase of its economic war footing, because today is April 15th. And in Canadian trade policy, that date carries specific weight that goes back exactly 1 year. On April 15th, 2025, the Carney government, then a caretaker administration in the middle of an election campaign, announced one of the first major structural responses to the Trump tariff regime. It issued a 6-month remission order, creating a temporary pause on Canada's retaliatory tariffs for goods imported from the United States to be used in Canadian manufacturing, processing, and food and beverage packaging, as well as goods used for public health, healthcare, public safety, and national security objectives. The purpose was stated plainly: to give Canadian businesses more time to adjust their supply chains and become less dependent on US suppliers, while not letting the pain of the trade war hit Canadian manufacturers who still needed American components to keep their operations running. That measure ran for 6 months and was extended twice, lasting through the end of 2025. Canada also simultaneously launched the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility, a program designed to support large Canadian businesses struggling to access liquidity as the trade war pressed down on their operations. What Carney has now, that he did not have when those measures were first issued, is a majority government. And that changes the architecture of every decision that follows. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne pushed back sharply this week against opposition claims that Canada had quietly dropped nearly all of its retaliatory tariffs. He called those claims falsehoods. He noted on social media that to retaliate against US tariffs, Canada launched its largest ever response, including $60 billion of tariffs on end-use goods, and that 70% of those tariffs are still in place. His spokesperson confirmed that Canada continues to charge tariffs on roughly 43 billion Canadian dollars, or about 31 billion US dollars, worth of American goods. The calibration, as the spokesperson put it, was designed to respond to the United States while limiting economic harm to Canada. That framing, maximum impact abroad, minimum damage at home, is Carney's stated doctrine going back to his election campaign. He used that exact language the day Trump announced 25% auto tariffs in March 2025, saying Canada's retaliatory response would have maximum impact in the US and minimal impact here in Canada. What is now different is that the USMCA review, the single most consequential trade negotiation on the North American calendar, is scheduled for July 2026. And Canada enters that review with a 4-seat majority, a prime minister polling at 52% preferred as PM against Poilievre's 24%, according to Nanos Research. A clean sweep of all 3 by-elections that the Liberals were not expected to win so comprehensively, and a global economic diversification strategy that has been running at full pace for more than a year. The Globe and Mail reported that the Liberals hold 45% national support versus 32% for the Conservatives and 12% for the NDP in the latest polling. That is not a government bracing for pressure. That is a government that has absorbed every escalation the Trump administration has thrown at it and come out the other side with more seats, more stability, and more international partnerships than it started with, which brings you to Tokyo. Because the Japan trip is where Carney's majority and his trade strategy converge in a way that makes the full picture visible. On March 6, 2026, 6 weeks before the by-elections confirmed his majority, Carney flew to Tokyo on the final stop of a 10-day tour that also included Mumbai, New Delhi, Sydney, and Canberra. It was the first bilateral visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Japan in 10 years. Carney met with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who had just won a landslide electoral victory of her own. Carney was the first world leader to visit Takaichi since her win. At the signing ceremony in Tokyo, he opened his remarks in Japanese, halting by his own performance, but notable for a man who had spent years working for Goldman Sachs in Tokyo in the 1990s and retained enough of the language to use it on a formal diplomatic occasion. Takaichi described the partnership as a new chapter and a historic milestone in more than a century of Canada-Japan diplomatic ties. What they signed was a comprehensive strategic partnership covering defense, economic security, energy, technology, and trade. The agreement includes a comprehensive strategic roadmap, commits both foreign ministries to overseeing implementation and coordinating new initiatives, and directs cooperation across LNG and liquefied petroleum gas exports, nuclear technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, clean energy technologies, critical minerals, cybersecurity, and supply chains. The two countries pledged to deploy a Team Canada trade mission to Japan in 2026. And Japan's Business Federation committed to an upcoming visit to Canada to unlock new commercial partnerships. Canada agreed to accelerate 7 LNG export projects that are in various stages of development. Japan, which imports approximately 87% of its energy needs, stands to become a significant long-term buyer of Canadian liquefied natural gas. Japan is a $5.5 trillion market and the world's 4th largest economy. It is Canada's 4th largest source of foreign direct investment with nearly $40 billion in bilateral trade. And 70% of all light vehicles currently manufactured in Canada are made by Japanese companies, primarily Honda and Toyota, a figure that has risen from 44% in 2016 as American automakers have pulled back from Canadian vehicle assembly under pressure from Washington to bolster U.S. manufacturing. That last statistic is the one that makes Washington uncomfortable in the most specific terms, because the shift of light vehicle production in Canada from 44% Japanese to 77% Japanese over a decade represents an organic, market-driven realignment that is now being actively reinforced by a diplomatic partnership and an investment framework backed by a majority government. The Tokyo trip followed visits that produced over $5 billion in commercial agreements with India, including commitments in uranium, pharmaceuticals, and beauty products, alongside a pledge to sign a free trade agreement with India by the end of 2026. It followed the first bilateral visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Australia since 2007, during which Australia's IFM investors, one of the world's largest pension fund managers, pledged to invest up to $10 billion in Canadian infrastructure over the next decade, and signalled interest in acquiring ownership stakes in Canadian airports and possibly major roads. Carney also addressed both houses of the Australian Parliament, the first Canadian Prime Minister to do so in nearly 20 years. He told the assembled members that allies must draw closer as the global order is breaking down. That is the sentence the Trump administration reads, not as a threat, not as a declaration of hostility, but as a signal that a country which was 2 years ago considered one of the most deeply integrated economies with the United States is now building, with formal diplomatic agreements and institutional frameworks, an alternative architecture that reduces the leverage Washington can apply. The CBC reported that since taking office, Carney has been outside of Canada 68 days in his first year, roughly 20% of his tenure, pursuing new trade agreements and investment partnerships. The Hub reviewed his 26 foreign trips and reported that no major comprehensive trade deals have yet been signed, noting that Carney has made important steps toward diversifying trade but has few concrete accomplishments to point to in terms of completed deals. That is the honest assessment of where the diversification strategy sits. Strategic partnerships, memoranda of understanding, investment commitments, and frameworks for future negotiations are not the same as ratified free trade agreements or finalized LNG contracts. The USMCA still covers over 85% of Canada-US trade. Canada still sends roughly 62% of US crude oil imports south every day. The economic integration is real and deep, and it will not be unwound in a year. But what is also real, and what the Tokyo partnership makes concrete in a way that was not true before, is that Carney has spent his first year in power building a parallel track, a track that now includes formal comprehensive strategic partnerships with Japan, India, and Australia, a China trade agreement that reduced tariffs on Chinese EVs in exchange for agricultural tariff relief, a Davos speech that earned a standing ovation from assembled world leaders and prompted Trump to respond publicly the very next day, a record-breaking Liberal National Convention attended by 4,500 members, a sweep of all 3 April by-elections by margins that exceeded the incumbents they replaced, and a Nanos poll showing Carney preferred as Prime Minister by 52% of Canadians versus 24% for Pierre Poilievre, and now a majority government. CNN noted this morning that Carney's majority will solidify his grip on power and allow him to push through an agenda that has largely focused on rebuffing Trump's tariffs and annexation threats and reducing Canada's dependency on its southern neighbour. The Washington Times reported that the Davos speech has certainly helped boost Carney's support at home and that he is now significantly more popular than when he became Prime Minister nearly 13 months ago. The Japan Times reported, in its coverage of the by-election results, that Carney secured a majority government, giving his administration the ability to push ahead faster with an economic agenda centered on expanding energy exports and reducing Canada's reliance on the US. That last framing, in a Japanese newspaper covering a Canadian by-election, is the geopolitical picture in miniature. Japan's media is covering Canadian domestic politics through the lens of what it means for LNG supply and energy security. That is not an accident. That is the direct consequence of the Tokyo Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, combined with a Canadian Prime Minister who flew to Tokyo, spoke in Japanese, and told his hosts that Canada has 7 LNG export projects in development and is ready to meet Japanese demand for low-emission energy. The framing works because it is grounded in reality. Canada does have those 7 projects. Japan does import 87% of its energy. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, completed before Carney took office, does give Canada the Pacific Coast export capacity that was not available a decade ago. And the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership does create an institutional mechanism for turning those complementary interests into formal supply agreements over the next several years. What Trump's response to the majority has been, as of this writing, is notable for its absence. There has been no Truth Social post targeting Carney by name since the by-election results came in. No renewed annexation rhetoric, no new tariff threats specifically tied to the majority result. What there has been, according to CTV commentary from former Conservative Cabinet Minister James Moore, is a political environment in which Canadians clearly aspire for the comfort of a majority government in a world rife with instability. Moore, who served in the Harper government, said of Poilievre's complaints that his argument is fair, before adding that it does not really matter. He told viewers to look to the horizon and not to the next polls. Look to 2029. That perspective reflects the shift that has happened in Canadian political culture over the past 13 months. The question is no longer whether Carney will survive the next confidence vote or whether a floor crossing will destabilize his government. Those questions are settled. The question now is what a majority government backed by 52% preferred PM polling, a 174-seat cushion, a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan, $5 billion in Indian commercial agreements, $10 billion in Australian investment commitments, a maintained China trade agreement, retaliatory tariffs still in force on $43 billion of US steel, aluminum and auto goods, and a 6-month trade relief framework protecting Canadian manufacturers will do with the time it now controls. Danielle Martin, speaking in her University-Rosedale victory remarks Monday night, put the mandate in terms that were deliberately not quiet. This is not a mandate to be quiet, she said. It is not a mandate to take our time. It is a mandate to get to work. And the work, by every available signal from the Prime Minister's office, the bilateral agreement signed in Tokyo, the LNG projects referred to the Major Projects Office for expedited approvals, and the USMCA review on the July calendar, is already underway.